To disagree. I'm Steve Walker. I'm a life and leadership coach and a meditation teacher. So, welcome. Thanks for tuning in. Um, this conversation today is about those times when uh, leaders realize that this is a moment when something above you is being decided and it's wrong, not just inconvenient, not even just suboptimal, but wrong. And what do you do about it? What do you do in that moment? Do you speak or stay silent? Right? Do you fight? And if so, what does that look like? And at what point do you decide to accept the outcome, even though it's not what you think is the right choice? It's the time when your integrity is probably most tested, right? Kind of at the deepest level. So, and then I want to also tie into it that in those moments, there's someone above you who also is facing a moment of courage and integrity. What do they do when the person who works for them comes to them in dissent? And how do you handle that? Right? So it's kind of those two pieces to it, right? You as a leader facing a moment where your integrity is on the line, right? Because something is being done above you that you might have to be a part of that you think is wrong, right? Morally, ethically wrong. And what happens if you're the person who is on the receiving end of that dissent, right? And first of all, let's talk about what principled dissent, because that's what we're really talking about here, right? The courage to disagree. It's not just disagreeing in a way, right? Disagreeing is personal often, right? I don't like this. This doesn't work for me. This makes me feel uncomfortable, but not in a moral or ethical way, right? Maybe it's because you're asking me to stretch myself, right? So what we're really talking about is the courage, not just to disagree, but to disagree in a context where it's about principled dissent to something that you feel is wrong. Principled dissent is values-based, right? It's about something that is contrary to what you think are your values, the values of the organization or company or the country, right? Whatever the context is. And you believe that whatever decision is being made, policy, initiative, whatever it is, that it stands in conflict with your values, right? With what you know to be right and wrong. And you can't stay silent about it anymore, right? Unfortunately, most organizations are full of lots of disagreement, often over things that are trivial or self-centered, and are starving for principled dissent. And, I've seen that in the government. I've seen it in education. I've seen it, through clients in the private sector. Lots of disagreement, not a lot of principled dissent. And part of it is that principled dissent requires something that just plain old disagreement doesn't usually. And it's the willingness to pay a price for what you believe in, right? Disagreement is often self-centered, right? And selfish to some extent. You don't like something, you don't feel like something, works best for you. And again, it makes you feel uncomfortable, challenged, whatever. Principled dissent, is about, yeah, I'm willing to pay a price to speak out about this, right? And to stand up for what I believe in. And it also, though, requires you to know which battles are worth fighting, because you can't dissent in a forceful way over everything that you feel um, you want to fight for. It's about clarity about like, when is it really a matter of integrity? Where is it really a matter of right and wrong? And how far am I willing to push this one, right? How serious a threat and lasting a threat is it to your integrity or the integrity of the organization or the company or the country or whatever it is? And I have a couple of stories that I think, one in particular, I think illuminates it. My background is I was a foreign service officer. I was a U.S. diplomat in my 20s. Spent 8 years in the foreign service, and I ended up quitting publicly. Right, this topic is near and dear to my heart, as a protest, as a principled dissent over the genocide in Bosnia. And but before that, I was my second tour. I was in Moscow at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, and part of my job was I was responsible for a lot of the human rights cases, people that we were trying to get out of the Soviet Union, that the Soviets wouldn't let leave. They included dual nationals, people who had both American and Soviet citizenship, divided spouses, people who were Soviet citizens but married to American citizens and wanted to leave and come live with them in the United States, right? As well as some other people who had been dissenters or, prominent refuseniks, people who, often were of Jewish ancestry who were trying to leave the Soviet Union, right? And weren't being allowed to leave. And so I took the plight of dual nationals and divided spouses very seriously. And when I took on that caseload, I wanted to travel around the Soviet Union to find these people and meet with them. We hadn't had contact with them in a while, and try to get them out, right? And so I did. I traveled to Ukraine, right? Far East, Western Ukraine, where there were a bunch. I traveled to Lithuania, right? Met with a lot of these people. Met with some of them in Moscow. Some of them came to Moscow to see me, and was raising their cases with the foreign ministry, the Soviet foreign ministry. And then there was this moment where the United States was negotiating with the Soviets around some of these human rights cases, and the Soviets' desire to host a big UN conference on human rights. And if the Soviet Union could host that, that would be a huge feather in their cap. It would show that they, are a leader in human rights in a way, right? By getting the stamp of the UN saying, yeah, you can host this conference on human rights. And we basically were saying to them, look, if you want to be able to host this conference, you got to resolve these human rights cases, right? You can't have these human rights cases unresolved if you're going to host this conference. So there were these negotiations, and it came to a head with, we were involved a little bit in it, again, at a lower level. And then things were coming to a head. We needed to we and the Soviets needed to make a final decision on this negotiation. So someone from the National Security Council staff, right, in the White House, an ambassador, was sent over to do the final negotiations with the Soviets. And I was going to be his assistant in those negotiations, right, and during his stay. So every day we would go meet with the Soviet negotiators and come back. I would write up a report. He would edit it, send it off to Washington. And it was clear a couple of days into this that he was going to cut a deal where the Soviets would agree to let some of the refuseniks, some of the people who were, say, of Jewish descent or ancestry, or had been dissenters within Soviet society, and I believe the divided spouses were going to be included, but the dual nationals would not be included. They would not be allowed to leave. But the Soviets would be allowed to host the Human Rights Conference. I thought that was wrong. I thought we were sacrificing American citizens' freedom for the sake of getting an agreement, right? And yes, we were getting some people out, but like these are American citizens. Like I was the head of American Citizen Services in the embassy at the time. Like protecting Americans and their freedom, that was job number one in my mind. And we couldn't sacrifice them to get out. We were going to get out Soviet citizens with no claim to American citizenship, right? Get them out, but not get out people who actually had American citizenship. That felt wrong to me. So I went to my boss, Max Robinson, who was the consul general in Moscow at the time. And I raised my objection to him. Now, Max had a choice, right? This is obviously a very high profile negotiation, and someone at a very high level from the White House was there doing the negotiations. And here I am, this, second tour foreign service officer. And I think a lot of bosses would have just said, like, suck it up, buddy. That's what this job involves, right? You got to suck it up. But he took it seriously. And I'm going to come back to that decision that he made later on. But he didn't dismiss it. He took it seriously. He didn't try to manage me and convince me to let it go. He said, you feel strongly about this? Strong sense of right and wrong. This feels like, I don't know if he used the word integrity at the time, but basically acknowledged this is a matter of integrity for me. And he's like, yeah, and you should dissent. When that happens, you should dissent. And there was a culture, to some extent in the Foreign Service, of dissent. It wasn't vibrant, ebbed and flowed, but certainly during the Vietnam War, there had been dissent. And there had been a dissent channel created, I think after the Vietnam War, and there had been some prominent resignations in the State Department in protest of the Vietnam War and the bombing of Cambodia. And there was a process for you to dissent all the way up to the Secretary of State if you had to. In this case, Max said, look, let's go up to the acting ambassador of, for the Soviet Union of the United States, right? The person who was in charge of our embassy. And you can make your case. And then if you convince him, he'll go to the White House on your behalf, right? Or maybe you with him. But, that's the way to do it in this case. So, he helped me prepare a little bit, but then we marched upstairs. We got an appointment with the acting ambassador, and I made my case directly, honestly, I thought quite forcefully, and I'd like to think compellingly and persuasively. We shouldn't be sacrificing American citizens' freedom for political expediency. That's what it felt like to me. And he heard me out, asked me some questions, and then said, nope, like, that's not going to happen. This deal is going to go through. I know you don't like it. I hear you. You make good arguments, but I am not going to, support this dissent farther up the chain of command. And I tried to make my argument again. He rebuffed again. I was almost going to do it again, and Max kind of read the room and read me, and Max just kind of whispered in my ear, we should go. This is not the sword to fall on. And I was immediately deflated. And we left, and on our way back to the consular section, Max said, look, I'm proud of you. You did a great job. You made a great argument. Here's the reality. Like, that guy knows, the political landscape in the White House right now. And that's a losing battle, clearly. And you need to know how to pick your battles. And, you went up and you fought for what you believed in. You've got a choice. You can use the Dissent channel and formally, protest to the Secretary of State. And that's your right, and you should do that if you feel compelled to. But you can also think about, like, how do you live to fight another day? And that this battle might be lost, but there's a bigger war, in a way, to be fought. And, this story isn't done. And it felt like defeat and frustration initially, without a doubt, right? Knowing that these American citizens were still going to be trapped in the Soviet Union. And these people who I knew now, right? These were people, faces and names. And to whom I'd committed to, helping get out of the Soviet Union. And so it felt personal, like a personal obligation in a way as well, and my integrity. But Max helped me see, I think, that this was a temporary setback. Fight another day. There are bigger battles ahead, and he was right. The Soviets got to host that human rights conference, but by making that compromise with them so that they still saved face by not letting Soviet citizens leave, which would be embarrassing leading up to this conference. After the conference was over, we were able to more quietly get the Soviets to agree to let most of those people go. And so eventually they all had the ability to leave if they wanted to. And I helped resettle some of them in the United States. And even one of them that I'd gotten to know pretty well, got to visit him and take him around Washington, D.C. and show him the historic sites and all that, the Smithsonian. It was really amazing. This guy was 60 something years old, probably about my age now. And, first time as an adult stepping foot in the United States. It was really, really quite powerful. I'm even feeling a little emotional talking about it right now. So eventually we were able to win the war in a way, right? But it required some nuance and some flexibility in the short term, right? And, in the end, the ambassador from the White House was right. And our acting ambassador at the embassy, was either right or at least, made a calculation that in hindsight didn't look so bad, right? But I was very proud of the fact that I had, stood up for what I believed and made a principled dissent. And sure enough, there were bigger battles ahead for me as well, when I would really need to make some serious choices about sacrificing for what I believed in. Not every disagreement, not every time you feel that there's a wrong decision being made deserves the same full principled stand, right? And any ultimate sacrifice, right? Eventually, I faced that kind of ultimate sacrifice, right? In terms of career, I gave up my career over the genocide in Bosnia. I felt that we were complicit in that genocide. And we were going to risk American soldiers' lives to enforce an ethnic partition of a country, essentially finishing a genocide. That's wrong. We don't do that, in my mind. And so, like in that case, I had the clarity, and I'd already prepared myself for that kind of internal dialogue and decision making because of what I'd been through before, right? And the support that Max had given me to make a decision to go up and dissent, but also to decide, okay, do I take it farther than this right now? Or do I move on and fight another day? And in that case, I decided to move on and fight another day, right? And in the long run, still got what I wanted. So I was prepared when I got to the Bosnia decision, though it was a very difficult one. And for weeks, I, really struggled with it. But then finally, things got to a point policy-wise where it was crystal clear to me. right? And I think that's part of it. Like, I think the first part is to realize, like, look, you can't be like Don Quixote, tilting against windmills all the time. That's going to destroy your credibility and burn you out, right? And you'll waste it on things that aren't really the important things, right? Or the things that you might be able to affect change on, right? Or that really are the ultimate, test of your integrity, right? The first thing you have to do really is to get clarity about your values. And if you don't have clarity about your values, that's something I help people with all the time. And particularly as a leader, you've got to have clarity about your values, because you might find them come under challenge, right, or threat. And having real clarity in advance can be really helpful for that, right? That when you're not under pressure and feeling like your nervous system is dysregulated, you're in fight or flight, like, that's not the time to figure out what your values are, right? You got to figure out what you really believe and how deeply you believe in each of them. And then when you feel like you're faced with that moral or ethical dilemma that's challenging your values, I think you've got to do your due diligence, right? You've got to really think it through, and you've got to weigh pros and cons of whatever actions you're thinking of taking to dissent, and the costs and benefits of not dissenting, right? Which is important. Sometimes we just look at the costs and benefits. That's why I think a lot of people don't dissent, right? They don't speak up when they disagree, because they look at the pros and cons of dissenting, and the cons might be pretty daunting, right? Reputation, relationships, jobs, careers, right? All that might be on the line. And so I think you've also got to look at the pros and cons of not, right? For me, and the decision to dissent on Bosnia by quitting publicly, like, I realized that, I was having trouble sleeping at night. My integrity, my ability to look myself in the mirror and like and respect the person I saw was on the line. And I felt like, even though my quitting might be just a drop in the bucket and not make much of a difference, it might, and that people needed to know that what was going on was wrong. And if there was an ability to create additional pressure to change the policy, then I needed to be a part of that, right, regardless of the outcome. And if you've done that due diligence to think this through, then you can listen to your gut, you can listen to your intuition, right? Because I think we don't want to be impulsive and just, like, on a dime go like, that seems wrong, I'm going to quit, or that seems wrong, I'm going to go dissent, or I'm going to speak out, publicly attack, my bosses, or something like that. I think it's more about, like, yeah, do your due diligence, think it through, weigh pros and cons, right? Pros and cons of not taking action or taking a stand. And then you're going to know. I think most of the time you're going to know, right? What the right course is, right? It's not like I feel so strongly that I must be right. It's like, I've thought this through too, and I still feel strongly, or I feel even more strongly, right? That's what you're looking for. And if you're being honest with yourself, then trusting where you end up there, right? You're not going to fight every battle. Like, you try and fight every battle, you're going to lose the war probably. But if you never fight any battle, you run the risk of losing yourself and losing your integrity. That you don't want to do, right? So it's clarity about values, doing your due diligence, weighing the pros and cons of acting and not acting, right? Speaking up and not speaking up, and then trusting your gut, right? Based on your experience and your informed thinking and your clarity about your values, right? Now, there's the other side of it that I said I was going to come back to, and that's the Max Robinson side of it, right? My boss that I went to in the embassy in Moscow when I initially had my disagreement, my dissent. about the policy, right? About sacrificing, at least in the short term, these American citizens' freedom. And that may be even the more important thing as a leader that we're going to face. We're going to have people come to us as leaders who are going to dissent. And what do you do with it? And a lot of the time, leaders squelch it. Their own insecurities, their own desires for control get in the way of them tolerating dissent. And I came up in the Foreign Service during a time when there were a lot of like bullies and screamers and yellers, right? That they led by intimidating you. But that's not real leadership, right? That's insecurity. This desperate, desire to control and suppress dissent, right? Compel compliance. But Max took it seriously, right? He took me seriously, and he valued it, and he tried to empower me to speak up for what I believed in, which was an incredible learning experience for me, and validating and empowering. I don't think I end up quitting publicly over the genocide in Bosnia and becoming an activist if not for Max Robinson in that moment in Moscow, validating my dissent, right? And helping me feel empowered to go up to someone much higher than me and much more intimidating to dissent and go against what the White House representative was doing, right? That took some guts, and he encouraged me, right? Not egging me on, but supporting me. Like, if that's what you want to do, I'm behind you, right? And stood behind me, right? And beside me when I did it. That was integrity on Max's part, right? To, value and empower the people who work for you, to take their dissent seriously. Didn't mean that Max necessarily agreed with me on everything, but he felt that it was a legitimate dissent, and wanted me to feel empowered to make it, right? The lesson that I took away from it in terms of what was safe, with him as my boss, and taking risks and advocating for things that I believed in, that made me a better Foreign Service officer the rest of my tour, the rest of my career in the Foreign Service, and made me a better everything activist, educator, right? That it is okay, if not encouraged, to stick up for what you believe in and advocate for ideas that you care about. Right? If you dismiss it, if Max had dismissed that when I came to him, then I would have learned, at least in the short term, to be quiet, to not dissent, right? Keep my mouth shut. If it gets punished, right, which the acting ambassador could have done that too, then it's even worse. You don't just stay silent. You learn to perform agreement, right? Compliance. You don't want an organization where that's the way people behave, where they all stay quiet because they're afraid of, rustling the feathers, rattling the cages, getting people above them ticked off, getting punished, right? You want people to raise different ideas and take some intellectual risks and point out when things are going wrong, right? That's how you avoid disaster, how you avoid catastrophic mistakes, right? Even the acting ambassador, who ended up disagreeing with me, but he took me seriously, right? Even though he disagreed with me, teaching me the lesson that honesty and integrity were valued in that embassy under his leadership. Amazing, right? That was amazing, right? What Max and the acting ambassador both did was was phenomenal in that case. It should be what every leader does, but it's not. That tends to be the exception, I think, a lot of the time. Certainly my first tour in the Foreign Service, that was the exception, right? Um, and then when I did lose, right? Max didn't let me spiral or catastrophize. He gave me a great way, a new lens of thinking about this, of reframing it, recalibrating, preserving my energy for what would come next, right? And which allowed us eventually to help get these people out. And for me to have a successful, albeit short, career in the Foreign Service, and to have a successful career as an activist and eventually as an educator, and even now as a life coach and a leadership coach, right? That's what leadership is. That's what Max demonstrated was leadership, not just tolerating dissent, certainly not squelching it or discouraging it, but not just tolerating it, but he guided me through the process, right? And coached me, mentored me, empowered me, right? Even in short-term defeat, right? Amazing. And none of this is easy. What Max did wasn't easy. What I did wasn't easy. It took courage for both of us, right? But that's why it's called courage. Courage requires fear, right? Uncertainty about the outcome. Otherwise, you wouldn't need courage, right? But we need to have courage for these things. And we need to develop that courage, right? To be able to speak up, even when you know it might cost you something, even if it's just some trolls on the internet laying into you, right? We need to be able to speak up when things really matter, right? Particularly when our integrity is on the line, right? And we need to be able to sometimes accept losses and setbacks without feeling like it's the end of the world and our conviction about what's right and wrong is going to be lost. Like, no, we can still have our convictions and accept that sometimes in the short term, we're going to get setbacks. We're going to have defeats. That lesson I took into the activism. And when we initially had some victories in the Congress, getting our legislation passed, but in a conference committee, it all got watered down and it was this huge defeat in a way, it was so deflating. But I was able to handle that pretty darn well because I knew I'm in this for the long haul. You lose the battle, like we won a battle, and then we lost the next battle. We live to fight again. Still have my convictions. I still know what's right and wrong. Not giving up on this, right? That was internalized and within me from what happened back in Moscow, right? Trusting your informed gut when the safer move is silence, right? Like that, I trusted my gut, right? In both cases. And I'm proud of the fact that I did that, right? That mattered to me. And the first one made it easier for me to do it in the second one, right? And that trust is important, right? Because courage is not the absence of doubt, quite the opposite. As I said before, courage is what's needed when things are uncertain, right? But it's doing it anyway because you've done the work, you've thought it through, you trust your gut, you know what matters, you've got clarity about your values, and you go ahead and still do it, right? That's what courage is. So, I would ask you to take a moment of reflection and think about, is there something within your organization, your team, your family, even your community, your country that you disagree with? And it's not just like a little disagreement or something you just don't like out of personal preference, but you think it matters in terms of your values and principles of your company or organization or your family or your community or your country. And, so it's not just a preference, it's like a real matter of a values conflict. And have you done the due diligence, thought things through, weighed pros and cons, done your research, reliable information. What does your gut tell you to do? And we faced this moment now as in the United States as a country where there are lots of things that come up that I think are testing us in this way. And what are you willing to do about it? Right? What does your gut say? If you've thought it through, what does your gut say? Um, do you need to send a letter to a member of Congress or a state legislator about something that matters, or speak up at a town meeting, or say something at the dinner table in your family about, some dynamic or something that you feel is unhealthy, or, where the values of your family are being tested, right? Someone who needs your help as a family, and maybe you need to stand up for that person, like whatever it is, get some clarity about that. And, think about what you're protecting by staying silent, and what could be protected by not staying silent, right? Having the difficult conversation, being a leader, right? Maybe there's someone in your organization or your family or your company or your community who has come to you with a dissent, and you didn't take it seriously. Maybe you should, right? What can you do differently with that? Have you created a culture on your team, in your organization, where people feel safe coming to you when they disagree with you, right? It's important, right? Do you mentor people when they disagree? Or do you block them, punish them, embarrass them, right? These are good questions to think about, right? If you'd like to talk about this in more depth, reach out to me. You can go to integrityandjoy.com and schedule a free discovery call, and we can have a talk about how to develop your leadership capacity, how to shift maybe some mindsets and paradigms about dissent and the courage to speak up, how to create a culture in which people feel safe bringing up new and different ideas, and pointing out when things aren't going well, and not just being malcontents and disagreeable, but being problem solvers alongside of you, which is what we want, right? I'd love to have that conversation with you. Thanks for watching this. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Be well.